Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And I'd like to continue on with the video a day during this month of October 2020, wherein I'm trying to share with you some thoughts or comments that I have regarding films, or in some cases TV series, that in one way or another, in my view, can seem to be said to be in spirit with the current season that we find ourselves in here, October, of course, 2020, and the proximity that we find ourselves to the Halloween season. So what I have today is a film from 1972. Now, this film might not necessarily seem at first glance to be quote-unquote a horror film, so some might be a little bit surprised by my mentioning this film in the context of this series of videos. However, at the same time, I do look at the month of October and the horror or scary film element to this season. I look at it to be also an opportunity to maybe explore films that might not necessarily, at least at first glance, fall within the horror genre necessarily. But upon close inspection, I think we can find, especially with the film that I'm going to bring up, I think we can find a number of elements that could be described as being scary, unsettling, and maybe, yes, horrific, as well as a number of different elements in this film that I'll try to discuss in brief right now. But it's this film. This is the 1972 film directed by Alfred Hitchcock, which is called Frenzy. Now, what I have here is the Blu-ray set called the Alfred Hitchcock Masterpiece Collection, and it has a number of films, one of which being the film Frenzy. So I'll try to keep that here like so. There we go. So the film Frenzy is a very interesting work. It could be described as being a suspense thriller, which it is. It could be described as being a very black comedy, which it is. It could also be described as being a, some might call it a return to form of Alfred Hitchcock, often known often known among many people as the master of suspense because of the films that he is known for and having directed, having a thriller or suspense element to them in a primary way. Frenzy, I think, being no exception to that. This is a very suspenseful and funny and clever film. But this is seen to be in many ways a return to form in a maybe general critical assessment of his later works. And it's also seen to be a return to a film that is shot and set in a particular area of London, England. And so we know that Alfred Hitchcock had a very illustrious and long career, the early part of which was focused on making films in England. And so this film, Frenzy, being a film in a similar vein, I think leads one to look at this film after considering all the elements in an overall way, to be a kind of return to form. But be that as it may, however one sees this film in the context of Alfred Hitchcock's career overall, I think we can all see too that there are a lot of elements here that make this film very fun, very thrilling, very suspenseful, very exciting, and yes, very scary, and oftentimes quite dark and bleak and unpleasant, and oh yes, quite horrific. So we have a film about a killer, a murderer, a serial killer in London during this time, and we also have the idea of the innocent man on the run. We have someone who is down on his luck. We also have the notion of the investigation, the police investigation, and we have along the way a lot of situations where viewer sympathies are either allied or upended We see villainous turns that are also very cheeky, very witty, turns into perhaps even the macabre and the sinister and the cold, but that also have elements of wry, dry humor, but also quite almost dramatically bombastic elements too. And I think this is all to suggest the very exciting visual drive that is at play here in this Alfred Hitchcock work. And it feels like while this is undoubtedly a film that falls in the later part of Alfred Hitchcock's career, nevertheless, I think that is a film that has so many visual thrills and camera techniques that are dazzling, and tricks of the eye that are very clever, and turns of narrative as well that are quite unexpected in a lot of ways from certain points of view, such that I think we are getting, as I tried to describe earlier, perhaps a film that could be said to be a return to form on the one hand, but it is also a film that feels very experimental. It feels very rough. It feels very dark and bleak, and perhaps even bleaker than the type of Alfred Hitchcock films that we might be used to up to now. So there is a real sense of the sinister at work in the world, and perhaps there is a sense of hopelessness as well. And this all feeds into the overall dread and atmosphere, which is, as I suggest to you also, I think very nicely balanced and buoyed by the notion of humor and the clever wit of the filmmakers concerned. So there's a nice balance there that's struck, I do admit that. But at the same time, there are some really scary moments, very scary moments, and the line and the train of narrative bleakness that flows to the conclusion of the film, I think, is another cause for looking at this film as a film that has some pretty horrific elements to it. So it is a scary film. It's a funny film. It's a film that has some comic moments, very clever moments as well. But it is also a film that has some pretty, I think, scary and horror moments too. And so I think it's a film that is an interesting watch during the month of October. I suppose I could have chosen as well maybe another Alfred Hitchcock film, maybe more in keeping with, say, the Halloween season. Perhaps a film like Psycho comes to mind. A film like The Birds comes to mind. And so please don't consider my discussion of Frenzy to be in any way a comment on my views on Psycho or The Birds. On the contrary, I think those films are very worthy, and I admire those works immensely. And perhaps one of these days I might be fortunate enough to be afforded the opportunity to try to speak a little bit about those films in more detail on this channel if the opportunity arises, which I hope it does. But I do want to then also emphasize that I think Frenzy too is a very good and effective chiller, and it is a thriller. It could also be seen as being almost, in an interesting way, a kind of take on the contemporary crime thriller of the day, the early 1970s. I do see also some interesting parallels that could be made with, say, the Italian giallo thriller. I know it's not an absolutely a rock-solid, perfect comparison, but I do see some, I think, reasonable connections that can be made between that genre or subgenre or subcategory of cinema and the work Frenzy that we have from Hitchcock in the early 1970s here, in terms of a kind of fresh boldness of style, a directness of camera technique, the fluidity of camera work sometimes, or oftentimes, or many times, as in the case of Hitchcock, as we know, the notion of the absurd, the absurdly comic that can turn suddenly quite horrific at a moment's notice, and the swirl of the narrative that I think lends itself quite richly to a sense of helplessness and a sense of hopelessness. And it's against these odds that we hope that the hero or the heroes or the anti-heroes can win out in the end. And that therein lies the suspense drama that keeps us riveted as viewers. And so these and other things, I think, make for interesting comparative analysis. But coming back to the central focus on Frenzy to conclude this video, I can say that, as I indicated earlier, there are some very disturbing moments here. And the landscape is dark and bleak. And I think in those fundamental terms, I think this film is a chiller. And it is a chiller, and it is an entertainment as well, because we can laugh along the way and we can marvel at the technical and cinematic craftsmanship that is on display in full, vivid color. And we see that Alfred Hitchcock still had it in the early 1970s, and he gave us a thrilling, electrifying, and a scary entertainment in the form of this interesting work from him. It's called Frenzy. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much for your time, as always, my dear friends, and cheers.